The inspection began, as all things in Laurel Hills did, with a polite, razor-edged smile. It was a Tuesday in early October, the air crisp with the promise of autumn. James Rayner stood on his back patio, a lukewarm mug of coffee in his hands, and watched the two figures from the Architectural Control Committee pace his yard like appraisers at an estate sale. Mr. Henderson, a retired accountant with a ruler-straight posture, held the clipboard. Ms. Albright, a woman whose loyalty to the board president was the stuff of neighborhood legend, held the tape measure. Their focus was the shed. It was a small structure, no more than 10 by 12 feet, nestled beside the memorial garden he had cultivated for his late wife, Charlotte. He had built it himself, the plans drawn with the same precision he'd once used for municipal bridges. The siding was painted the same slate gray as his house. The trim, a matching bone white. To him, it was an extension of his home, a quiet workshop where the scent of sawdust and Charlotte's favorite potting soil could mingle. To them, it was a potential violation. The setback from the rear property line seems adequate. Gerald, Ms. Albright said, her voice carrying a note of disappointment. She snapped the tape measure shut. Henderson made a note. Indeed. 15 feet, 6 inches. The guidelines require a minimum of 10. He didn't look at James. He was a man who preferred to communicate with his clipboard. They moved to the garden, Charlotte's garden. It was a controlled wilderness of lavender, coneflowers, and a stubborn climbing rose that had been her pride. At its center was a simple stone bench where he often sat in the evenings. The landscaping is vibrant, Albright offered, the word landing with the thud of an insult. My wife designed it, James said. His voice even, she preferred a natural look. Henderson peered at the small brass plaque on the bench. In memory of Charlotte Rayner. He cleared his throat, a flicker of something human crossing his face before it was extinguished by procedure. The structure. Mr. Rayner. The workshop. We have no record of an architectural application being submitted for its construction. It's under the square footage requirement for a county permit, James replied calmly. He was a retired civil engineer. He knew codes and regulations better than most people knew their own families, and its design is harmonious with the primary residence, as stipulated in the covenants. Harmonious is a subjective term, Albright countered, her smile tightening. The board makes the final determination on aesthetic matters. They circled the shed one last time. They took photographs. They measured the roof pitch. The entire performance was a masterpiece of passive aggression, a bureaucratic ballet designed to unsettle. After 15 minutes that felt like an hour, they concluded their inspection. You'll receive a formal summary of our findings from the property management company, Henderson said, finally making eye contact. Have a pleasant day, Mr. Rayner. They walked away, their whispers swallowed by the breeze. James remained on his patio, his coffee now cold. He knew this wasn't about a shed. This was about Karen Whitlock, the board president. And it was about a soil mechanics report from 12 years ago that had cost her husband a fortune. He had been the expert witness on that report, the one whose testimony about unstable substrate and inadequate deep foundation piers had halted the development of the Northgate shopping mall, a project the Whitlock family had championed. They had never forgiven him for it. Karen had simply been waiting, biding her time until she had the power, the process, and the pretext to return the favor. The shed was her pretext. He went inside to his study and pulled a thick, 3-ring binder from the shelf. Laurel Hills, HOA governing documents. He thumbed through the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the CC&Rs, until he found the section on architectural modifications. He read the clause they would inevitably use against him. Figure 8.4.2. All improvements, structures, and landscaping modifications must maintain an aesthetic harmony with the community's natural setting and the overall architectural theme of Laurel Hills. He ran a finger under the line. Vague enough to be trouble. He thought, vague enough to be a weapon. James Rayner had lived a life of precision. As a civil engineer, he had built a career on the unyielding certainties of physics and mathematics. Stress loads, tensile strength, soil density. These were the languages he spoke. There was a right way and a wrong way, and the difference was measured in millimeters and backed by calculations that left no room for interpretation. He'd brought that same order to his life. He and Charlotte had planned their home in Laurel Hills with meticulous care, choosing lot number 114 because it backed onto the community's protected common area, a sliver of preserved woodland that served as a buffer from the world. After Charlotte passed from a sudden illness 5 years ago, that order had been his only anchor in a sea of chaotic grief. He retired, his passion for building grand structures for the public replaced by a quiet need to build a small sanctuary for himself. The shed and the garden were that sanctuary. Every joint in the workshop's frame was perfect. Every perennial in the garden was planted exactly where Charlotte had sketched it in her journals. It was his last collaborative project with her, a tribute of wood, stone, and soil. He was a quiet resident, a widower who kept to himself, paid his dues on time, and expected only to be left alone in the home he and his wife had built together. Karen Whitlock, on the other hand, thrived on interpretation. She had ascended to the board presidency on a platform of protecting our property values, a slogan that translated to a zealous, almost fanatical enforcement of the community's aesthetic code. Her rule was absolute. Her interpretation of the CC&Rs, the only one that mattered. Behind her immaculate blazers and practiced smile was a will of iron and a memory as long and unforgiving as a legal contract. The memory of the Northgate Mall failure was her primary motivation. James's testimony hadn't just cost her husband's development firm millions. It had been a public humiliation. The local paper had run a story with the headline, "Engineer's Report Reveals Cracks in Northgate Foundation," effectively ending the project and tarnishing the Whitlock name. For years, she had treated James with a cold, distant politeness at the annual neighborhood barbecue, but he could feel the weight of her resentment every time she looked at him. Now, she was board president. Now, she had an army of committees and a property management company to do her bidding. His daughter, Sarah, an attorney who lived 3 states away, was his emotional anchor. He called her after the ACC inspection. "They're coming for the shed, sweetheart," he said, trying to keep his tone light. "Dad, it's not just a shed. It's Charlotte's workshop," she replied, her voice laced with concern. "What are you going to do?" "Follow the procedure," he said. "Present the facts. Logic has to prevail." "Doesn't it?" "Not in an HOA," she said softly. "Please be careful. Don't let her get to you. This is exactly what she wants." He promised he would, but as he hung up the phone, he looked out the window at the workshop, its roofline clean against the darkening sky. It was more than wood and nails. It was a testament, a final conversation with his wife. And he would not let Karen Whitlock tear it down with a clipboard and a vaguely worded bylaw. The letter arrived a week later, on October 15th. It came via certified mail, the ominous green slip tucked into his mailbox like a warrant. The envelope was from Prestige Management Solutions, the third-party property management company PMC that served as the HOA's administrative arm. James signed for it with a steady hand, the mail carrier offering a sympathetic nod. He knew the look. He'd seen it on the faces of neighbors who'd been cited for leaving their trash bins out an hour too long, or for having a basketball hoop with a frayed net. He sat at his kitchen table and slit the envelope open with a butter knife. The letterhead was crisp, the language sterile and suffocatingly polite. Formal notice of violation. Case 3 Younger Fee, 2023-114. Property, 1-28. Blossom Lane. Lot, 0114. Date of notice, October 14th, 2023. Date of observation, October 8th, 2023. Dear Mr. Rayner, this letter serves as a formal notice of a violation of the Laurel Hills Homeowners Association's covenants, conditions, and restrictions (CC&Rs). Following a recent inspection by the Architectural Control Committee (ACC), it was determined that an unapproved modification has been made to your property. Violation, CC&R. For 8.4.2, unapproved structure detached workshop, shed. Per the governing documents, all detached structures, regardless of size, must receive prior written approval from the ACC to ensure aesthetic harmony with the community's natural setting. Required corrective action. 1. Remove the unapproved structure from the property within 30 days of the date of this notice. Or 2. Submit a complete architectural modification application, including detailed plans and material specifications. For the board's review, please be advised that submission does not guarantee approval. Fine schedule. A fine of $100 has been assessed to your account, should the violation not be cured within 30 days. Further fines will be levied at a rate of $50 per day until the property is brought into compliance. You have the right to appeal this violation in writing or at the next scheduled Board of Directors meeting. We appreciate your cooperation in maintaining the standards that make Laurel Hills a premier community. Sincerely, Todd Becker, Community Manager. Prestige Management Solutions. James read it 3 times. They had bypassed the customary courtesy notice entirely, escalating directly to a formal violation and a fine. It was an aggressive, deliberate opening move. Karen wasn't just enforcing a rule, she was sending a message. He looked out at the shed, its windows dark. It wasn't just a structure. It was his. It was Charlotte's. And the battle had just officially begun. He picked up his pen and a legal pad and began to draft his appeal. He would start with logic. He would start with the facts. The Laurel Hills HOA Board of Directors meeting was held in the clubhouse's Magnolia Room, a space that smelled faintly of air freshener and simmering resentment. James arrived early, his file folder tucked under his arm. He wore a pressed shirt and his old engineering blazer, an armor of professionalism against the coming absurdity. He watched as the 5 board members took their seats at the long table at the front. Karen Whitlock sat in the center, presiding over the meeting with the serene confidence of a monarch. To her left sat Arthur Vance, a retired history professor who had been on the board for a decade and carried an air of weary decency. The other 3 were a blur of polo shirts and unwavering loyalty to Karen. When his agenda item was called, James walked to the residence podium. He laid out his case with methodical clarity. Good evening, Madam President, members of the board. He began. I am here to appeal violation V 2023-114 regarding the workshop on my property. I have 3 main points to present. He held up a copy of his original property plans, approved by the same ACC a decade ago. First, the shed is an accessory structure, not a modification to the primary residence. It is under 150 square feet, the threshold requiring a county building permit, and it adheres to all documented setback requirements. He then presented a series of photographs. Second, as you can see, the materials, Color palette and roof pitch are identical to my home. It is, by any reasonable definition, in aesthetic harmony with the property, as required by the CC&Rs. Finally, he concluded, I have reviewed the minutes from the past 5 years of ACC meetings. In that time, at least 7 other similar-sized sheds have been approved, some of which bear far less resemblance to their primary homes than mine does. To deny this structure would be an act of arbitrary and selective enforcement. He felt a small sense of satisfaction. His argument was logical, evidence-based, and irrefutable. Karen let the silence hang in the air for a moment before she responded, her tone patient and condescending, as if explaining a complex concept to a child. Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Rayner, she said, her pen tapping a soft rhythm on her notepad. However, you seem to be conflating county codes with community covenants. While the county may not require a permit, our governing documents supersede municipal ordinances on matters of aesthetics. That is the legal structure of a deed-restricted community. She continued, weaving a web of procedural jargon. Furthermore, the precedents you cite were approved under previous architectural guidelines, which were amended in 2021 to grant the board more discretionary authority over what constitutes harmony. As for the application, the violation was issued because no application was ever submitted for prior approval, which is the core of the infraction. The time to present your case for harmony would have been before construction, not after. It was a masterful performance. She had used his own logic against him, twisting his precision into a liability. She had made him sound like an uninformed amateur. I move to uphold the violation as issued by the ACC and to require Mr. Rayner to follow the standard application process for review. One of her loyalists said. Seconded, another chimed in instantly. Karen looked at the board. All in favor. 4 hands went up. Arthur Vance abstained, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. The motion carries, Karen announced, her eyes locking with James's. There was no triumph in her expression, only a cold, flat finality. Mr. Rayner, the violation stands. The fines will continue to accrue daily until the matter is resolved. Please submit your application to Prestige Management. Next item on the agenda. James walked back to his seat, his file folder suddenly feeling heavy and useless. He had come armed with facts, but he had walked into a battle of pure power. Sarah was right. Logic had no place here. He had lost the first skirmish. But as he sat there, listening to the drone of a debate over seasonal petunias, a new resolve hardened within him. If Karen wanted to fight with procedure, then he would become an expert in procedure. He would find the cracks in her foundation. The daily fines began to accumulate, a relentless digital drip of $50 charges appearing on his HOA account portal. It was a war of attrition, designed to bleed him out financially and emotionally. But James Rayner was an engineer. He knew how to analyze a system for its weaknesses. He would treat the Laurel Hills HOA not as a neighborhood association, but as a hostile structure he needed to deconstruct. He started with a call to Sarah. They shot me down. Used the rule book like a weapon. I'm sorry. Dad. What's the next step? An investigation, he said, a new energy in his voice. I'm going to find out what's really going on here. She urged caution, reminding him of the emotional toll. But he could hear the pride in her voice. His first ally was David Chen, his neighbor from 2 doors down. David was a recently retired paralegal, a quiet, unassuming man who possessed a ferocious passion for procedural justice and a deep-seated loathing for bureaucratic overreach. When James explained the situation over coffee on David's porch, David's eyes lit up. Selective enforcement and vague covenant language, David said, rubbing his hands together. That's their bread and butter. But they have an Achilles heel, the paper trail. Florida Statute 720 gives you the right to inspect and copy all official records. Together, they drafted a formal request letter, citing the specific statute. They didn't just ask for meeting minutes. They asked for everything: financials, contracts with vendors, all architectural applications approved and denied for the last 3 years, and all email correspondence between the board and the PMC related to his property. They sent it via certified mail to Todd Becker at Prestige Management. The response, when it finally came 2 weeks later, was a masterclass in obstructive compliance. He received a link to a password-protected online portal. Inside was a chaotic jumble of hundreds of PDF files. The meeting minutes were there, but entire paragraphs concerning land use and contractor bids were conspicuously blacked out. The financial records were high-level summaries, lacking the detailed vendor payments he'd requested. It was a data dump designed to overwhelm and conceal. "They're stonewalling," David said, peering at a heavily redacted page on James's monitor. "They've given us a mountain of paper to hide a needle. But look at this." He pointed to a blacked-out paragraph in the minutes of a Landscaping and Common Areas Subcommittee meeting. The title of the agenda item was visible: Discussion of CA, Parcel 7B Usage Proposal. "Parcel 7B," James asked. "Let's find it," David said. James retrieved his official property survey, the plat map he'd received when he closed on the house. They spread it across the dining room table. His lot. Watch 114 was clearly marked. The green expanse of the HOA common area stretched out behind it. And there, running along the entire length of his back property line, was a thin, 15-foot-wide strip of land labeled Unassigned Utility Easement. It was part of the common area, but it had no designated purpose, no power lines, no sewer mains, no drainage culverts marked. It was just a blank space on the map. It was Parcel 7B. "That's odd," James murmured, tracing the lines with his finger. "It's a dead-end easement. It doesn't connect to anything." He'd always assumed it was for some future county utility access, a placeholder left over from the original development plans. "An unassigned easement is an asset," David said, his eyes narrowing. "An undeveloped piece of land owned by the association, and the board was discussing a usage proposal for it, a proposal they don't want the residents to see." A cold feeling began to creep up James's spine. He looked from the plat map to his window, his gaze settling on the shed. The shed sat directly on his property line, abutting that very easement. A new, more sinister possibility began to take shape, one that had nothing to do with aesthetic harmony. The needle wasn't just in the haystack, they were standing right on top of it. David Chen was not easily deterred by digital roadblocks. His 30 years as a paralegal had taught him that laziness is the enemy of concealment. He spent 2 days meticulously examining the metadata of every file in the HOA's document portal, looking for inconsistencies. He found one in a large, poorly scanned bundle of receipts from the landscaping contractor. Tucked at the very end of the 200-page PDF, almost as an afterthought, was a single, crookedly scanned page that was clearly not a receipt. It was a printed email. Someone had likely included it in the scan pile by mistake. He called James immediately. "You need to see this. Now." James hurried over to David's home office, a room immaculately organized with binders and file boxes. On David's large monitor was the email. The sender was Karen Whitlock. The recipient was a man named Marcus Thorne, with an email address from Stonegate Development Group. The date was September 28th, 10 days before the ACC inspection. The subject line read, Laurel Hills Access Point. Confidential. The body of the email was short and devastatingly clear. Marcus. Following our conversation, the board subcommittee has discreetly approved the preliminary plan to sell the 15-foot unassigned easement behind lots 112, 118 to Stonegate. This will provide the private ingress-egress route to your proposed luxury estate property as requested. We can frame this to the community as a simple surplus land sale that adds to our reserve funds. There is one minor complication. The property at lot White 114. Rayner has a recently constructed shed that encroaches on the visual clearance and potential grading area for the access road. This will need to be removed. Rest assured, we are handling the obstruction through our standard compliance channels. I anticipate the lot will be clear for your surveyors by the end of the quarter. We look forward to a mutually beneficial partnership. Best, Karen Whitlock, President, Laurel Hills, HOA. James stared at the screen, a cold fury rising within him. Every piece fell into place. The inspection, the immediate escalation to a violation, the stonewalling, the jargon about aesthetic harmony. It was all a lie, a meticulously constructed pretext to force him to tear down his shed, clearing the way for a secret, lucrative land deal. Stonegate Development. He remembered the name. It was the new iteration of her husband's old firm. This wasn't just about an old grudge. It was about money and revenge, wrapped in the guise of HOA governance. She's selling off community property for her husband's benefit, James said, his voice dangerously quiet. And she's using the full power of the HOA to try and force me to clear the way for her. It's a massive conflict of interest, a breach of fiduciary duty, David confirmed, his expression grim. This is the smoking gun. James, this changes everything. The fight was no longer just about his shed or his wife's memory. It was about exposing a rot at the very core of their community. He now had the truth. The question was how to use it before the ticking clock of the HOA's legal machine ran out. Armed with the email, James felt a surge of confidence. The truth, he believed, was a shield. His first move was to confront the property manager, Todd Becker. He scheduled a formal meeting at the sterile offices of Prestige Management Solutions, hoping that a direct presentation of the evidence would force the PMC to distance itself from Karen's scheme. He sat across from Todd in a small, windowless conference room and calmly laid a copy of the email on the table between them. I believe this document clarifies the real reason for violation, v. 2023-114, James said. Todd read the email, and the color drained from his face. His professional veneer cracked, revealing a man terrified of liability. He pushed the paper back across the table as if it were radioactive. I have no knowledge of this, he stammered. Our company is contracted to enforce the decisions of the board. We are not involved in their internal deliberations or any land use proposals. You are the agent of the board, James pressed, and this email is evidence of a bad faith action and a breach of fiduciary duty. I am formally requesting that you advise the board to cease and desist all enforcement actions against my property immediately. Todd's eyes darted around the room. He was trapped. Mr. Rayner, this is a matter for the board and their legal counsel. It is outside the scope of my authority. I can only document your concerns. It was a classic stonewall, a retreat into the protective bunker of corporate policy. The meeting was over. Retaliation was swift and brutal. Karen must have been informed of his meeting with Todd within the hour. That evening, an email landed in James's inbox with a high-priority flag. Notice of emergency hearing and accelerated enforcement. It stated that due to his refusal to cure the ongoing violation, the board had voted in an emergency session to accelerate his case. A special hearing was scheduled in 1 week's time, before he could even fully process the implications. A courier arrived at his door the next morning. It was a thick envelope from the law firm of Smith, Cromwell and Finch, the HOA's attorneys. Inside was a document that made his heart pound with a dull, heavy pressure. Notice of intent to file a line. The legal language was dense and intimidating, but the message was simple. He had 30 days from the date of the notice to pay the accumulated fines which, with late fees and administrative charges, now totaled $2,450, or the association would place a lien on his property. A lien was the first step toward foreclosure. They were trying to take his home. The pressure was immense, a physical weight on his chest. This was Karen's endgame: to bury him in legal fees, threaten his most valuable asset, and force him into submission. He felt a wave of despair, the feeling of one man against a corrupt and powerful system. He immediately drove to Arthur Vance's house. He found the old professor pruning roses in his front yard. James laid out the entire story, from the shed to the easement to the smoking gun email and the intent to lien. Arthur listened in silence, his expression growing more troubled with each word. "I had no idea," Arthur said, setting down his shears. "She presented your case as a simple matter of non-compliance, a stubborn resident refusing to follow the rules." He looked at the email printout, shaking his head. This is an appalling abuse of power." "They've scheduled a hearing. They're going to formalize the fines and authorize the lien," James said. "What can I do?" Arthur sighed, the weight of his own complicity settling on his shoulders. "The hearing is a public forum. You have a right to speak. If you present this evidence there, in front of all the homeowners, it will cause an explosion. Karen will try to shut you down. But if you do it right, the residents will be your jury." He looked James in the eye. "It's a huge risk. It will get very ugly, very fast. But it may be your only move left." James looked toward his own home down the street, the home he had built with Charlotte. They had cornered him, threatened the last piece of the world that mattered to him. He had no choice. He would face them in the public forum. He would create the explosion. The clubhouse was packed for the special hearing, the air thick with a mixture of stale coffee, cheap perfume, and palpable tension. Word had spread. The combination of a potential foreclosure and James Rayner's quiet but steadfast reputation had drawn a crowd far larger than a typical board meeting. Homeowners stood along the back walls and spilled out into the hallway. James sat in the front row, a single manila folder on his lap. Beside him sat David Chen, offering silent, solid support. Sarah was on the phone, on speaker but muted in his pocket, a remote presence across the room. He saw Mrs. Ellison, a frail woman in her 80s, looking anxious. He had visited her the day before to apologize for what he was about to do, explaining that her identical, unsighted shed was a crucial piece of his defense. She had patted his hand and said, "Sometimes you have to turn on a small light to show how dark a room has gotten. You do what you must." James. Karen Whitlock sat at the center of the board table, a picture of composure in a navy blue blazer. She called the meeting to order, her voice crisp and authoritative. After a few procedural formalities, she announced the main event. "The board will now hear the matter of violation V 2023-114 regarding the property at 128 Blossom Lane. Mr. Rayner, you have requested time to speak. As per the bylaws for special hearings, you have 5 minutes." A large digital timer was projected on the screen behind her. its red numerals glowing 0500. James walked to the podium. He placed his folder on the lectern and inserted a small USB drive into the provided laptop. The timer started its silent countdown. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady, carrying through the silent room. "My name is James Rayner. The board is seeking to place a lien on my home over a shed. They claim it violates the aesthetic harmony of our community. I'm here tonight to show you that this has nothing to do with harmony. It has to do with corruption." A murmur went through the crowd. Karen stiffened. 0440. First, let's look at the violation. The first slide appeared on the screen, a picture of the violation notice next to the text of CC&R 8.4.2, a subjective rule, which the board is required to enforce fairly and consistently, but it has not. The next slide showed two photos, side by side, his own slate gray shed and an identical, slightly weathered white shed. This second shed belongs to Mrs. Ellison on Tulip Lane. It has stood for 5 years. It has never received a violation. I regret having to involve my neighbor in this, but true community requires that rules apply to everyone, not just to those who fall out of favor with the board. The room buzzed. Mrs. Ellison looked down at her hands. 0355. Karen's face was a mask of fury. "Point of order, Madam President." One of her allies called out. "The status of other properties is not relevant to this specific violation." "Sustained," Karen snapped. "Mr. Rayner, please confine your remarks to your own property." "My remarks are about a pattern of conduct," James said calmly. Advancing to the next slide, the screen showed the heavily redacted meeting minutes he had received. 03:10. "When I requested official records to understand this process, this is what I was given. Pages of black ink. What is the board hiding?" He clicked again. A new document appeared, the unredacted minutes David had uncovered. The text about Parcel 7B usage proposal was highlighted in yellow. They were hiding this a secret discussion to sell off a piece of our common property. He didn't give them time to react. The next slide was the smoking gun email from Karen to the developer. He read it aloud, his voice ringing with cold precision. "The Rayner shed is the only obstruction. We are handling it through our standard compliance channels." The room erupted. Shouts of "What? And is this real?" echoed off the walls. Karen was on her feet. "This is out of order. This is inadmissible. This hearing is about a covenant violation. Not this. This fabrication." Arthur Vance leaned into his microphone. "Let him finish." "Karen, the residents deserve to see this." 0150. The final slide appeared on screen. It was the plat map of the neighborhood. James used the laser pointer to trace the boundaries. "Here is my property. Here is my shed." The red dot rested on the corner of his lot. "And here is the unassigned easement. Parcel 7B, the land our president was secretly planning to sell to a development group run by her husband for a private road. My shed. The one that supposedly disrupts the aesthetic harmony of a forest. Just happens to be the only thing in the way of her secret deal." The timer beeped, its screen flashing 0000. James stepped back from the podium. He had laid out the facts. The case was built. The explosion Arthur had predicted was about to detonate. The Magnolia Room descended into chaos. The carefully managed decorum of the HOA meeting shattered into 100 angry questions. Homeowners were on their feet, shouting at the board table, their faces masks of betrayal and fury. "A secret land deal," a man in the back yelled. "You were going to sell our common area without a community vote." "Is that why our dues went up last year?" a woman cried out. "To pay for legal fees to push this through." Karen Whitlock banged her gavel, but the sound was lost in the uproar. Her face was pale, her composure finally shattered. She looked to Todd Becker, the property manager, for support, but he was already in damage control mode. He leaned over to the board's attorney, whispering frantically, the words liability, exposure, and bad faith clearly audible even over the din. Seeing his opportunity, Arthur Vance made his move. He stood and spoke into his microphone, his calm, authoritative voice cutting through the noise. I believe it is clear that we cannot proceed with the violation against Mr. Rayner at this time. New information has been brought to light that suggests a profound conflict of interest. I make a motion to table the violation and rescind all fines against Lot Yari 114 indefinitely, pending a full and independent investigation into this matter. Second, David Chen shouted from the audience, which was technically against procedure, but no one cared. All in favor of tabling the violation, Arthur asked the room at large. A forest of hands shot up from the audience. The other three board members, seeing the tide turn so violently, reluctantly raised their own. Karen sat, frozen, her hand not moving. The motion carries, Arthur declared. Before Karen could recover, another homeowner, a fiery woman from the Finance Committee, stood up. I move for a vote of no confidence in President Whitlock, and I demand a full, independent, forensic audit of this association's finances and all land use decisions for the past 3 years. The room erupted in applause and shouts of agreement. The property manager, seeing the legal and financial avalanche about to crush his firm, quickly stepped to the microphone. On behalf of Prestige Management, he said, his voice strained, we strongly recommend the board cooperate fully. We advise tabling all remaining agenda items to address this serious governance issue. The power structure had crumbled in less than 10 minutes. Karen Whitlock stared out at the sea of angry faces, her neighbors, the people she had ruled with an iron fist, and for the first time. She looked utterly defeated. She gathered her papers with trembling hands, stood, and walked out of the room without another word, the residents parting before her like the Red Sea. The explosion was over, and the old regime had been reduced to ash. In the weeks that followed, the Laurel Hills HOA underwent a seismic shift. Karen Whitlock and 2 of her most loyal board members resigned via terse emails. The independent audit revealed a pattern of non-disclosed conflicts of interest and questionable vendor contracts tied to the Whitlock family. The secret land deal with Stonegate Development was officially and permanently terminated. James received a formal letter from the new interim board, hand-delivered by Arthur Vance. It contained a full, unconditional reversal of the violation, a nullification of all fines, and a sincere, public apology for the unwarranted and malicious actions taken against him. The HOA also enacted a new transparency policy, requiring all land use proposals and significant contracts to be presented and ratified at a general meeting of the homeowners. James, having protected his home and his wife's memory, now took a constructive step. His first act was to personally help Mrs. Ellison draft and submit an architectural application for her shed. He spoke on her behalf at the next ACC meeting, and her application for a retroactive variance was approved unanimously in under 3 minutes. His next proposal was more ambitious. He drafted a plan, complete with engineering sketches, to officially convert the now infamous Parcel 7B from an unassigned easement into a registered community asset. He proposed turning the disputed strip of common area behind his home into a community garden, a place for native plants and pollinator-friendly flowers. The board enthusiastically approved it, voting to name it the Charlotte Rayner Memorial Garden. One crisp Saturday morning, as he was preparing to help clear the area for the new garden, James decided to finally clean out an old wooden seed box of Charlotte's that had sat in the workshop for years. It was filled with dried packets of seeds for flowers she never got the chance to plant. As he lifted out the last packet of forget-me-nots, his fingers brushed against a sealed envelope tucked into the bottom lining. His heart gave a lurch. It was Charlotte's handwriting. He opened it carefully. The note inside was short, her elegant script as familiar as his own reflection. My dearest James, if you're reading this, it means you've finally cleaned out my old seed box. It probably means you've decided to plant something new. I hope you have. This world can be a noisy, complicated place, and it is so easy to build walls to keep it out. But promise me you won't just tend the garden. My love, tend to the world. It needs your quiet strength more than you know. Reconnect. You are not meant to be alone. All my love, forever, C. James sat on the steps of the workshop, the note in his hand. He looked out past his own yard, toward the common area where his neighbors were already gathering with shovels and smiles, ready to help him build the garden. He had fought a battle, not just against a tyrant, but against his own isolation. He had defended his wife's sanctuary and, in doing so, had reconnected with the community she had always believed in. He was finally fulfilling her wish.